Good morning to you. Thank you, Sherman, for joining us. We are here just announced on the beginning of the 6th event for the medical device industry here in Israel. We have a full house, and we would like to start with your presentation.
All right.
Okay. So can you hear us very well?
I can hear you just fine.
Okay, wonderful.
Well, good morning, everyone, and greetings from St. Paul, Minnesota in the U.S., where it is finally spring after a long winter. And I'd very happy to be able to be with you and present to you this morning. I want to talk a little about regulations and standards, what's been happening in the past year or so, and some emerging issues that I think we'll see a lot more activity around over the next couple of years. So I'm sure you know regulations and standards in medical devices are very related. Regulations are there to assure that devices are safe, and standards are ways that we share information about things that experience has shown are good ways to make the devices safe. So I'm Sherman Eagles. Let me just give you a little bit about my background. I worked for Medtronic for 18 years here in Minnesota in the cardiac rhythm management group. I was a technical fellow working in software safety, software quality, software processes. I'm now retired from Medtronic, doing some consulting and training with a small consulting group called Software CPR. Over the past 15 years or so, I've been involved with doing standards, and I'm still involved with that. I was the convener of the working group for the Programmable Electrical Medical Systems portion of IEC 60601. I was also the convener for the IEC 62304 for medical device software lifecycle processes, and 80002-1 on applying risk management 14971 to medical device software. And more recently, I've been convening a group of standards and documents in the IEC 80001 series, and this is really getting into risk management when a medical device is part of a network. I'm also co-chair of the software advancement of medical engineering. So today, what I would like to do is talk a little about regulatory things that have happened recently, some of the standards activities that are going on and have happened recently, and then touch on these three areas where I think we're going to see a lot of activity over the next couple of years. For the most part, this is about software, although I am going to mention a couple of regulatory items that are a little broader than software, but that are important for software. So starting with some of the regulatory activities in the European Union, probably the most interesting development in the last year has been the fact that the European Commission has decided that the existing 13485 and EN 14971 do not actually cover all of the requirements that are in the essential requirements for quality management and risk management. So this has caused a bit of an issue in terms of the standards that we use to try to show conformance with these essential requirements. And some of the things that are of particular interest, I think, in 14971, which is probably where the change has been the most noticeable, is some of these things I've listed, that the manufacturer cannot by himself determine what is acceptable risk. We no longer can use as low as reasonably practicable. We have to now make risk as low as possible. We need to do risk-benefit analysis for each hazard, not just the overall residual risk. And we can't say that we're reducing risk by providing information to the users. So these are all changes that manufacturers are struggling with, and notified bodies are trying to understand how they can determine whether or not the essential requirements have been met when the standard can no longer be used in some of these areas. I'm sure you know about as well about the proposed medical device regulations that were introduced this year. The 3 existing medical device directives will become 2 regulations. The active implantable medical device directive and the medical device directive will be merged into a single regulation. The IVD directive will become the second regulation. And these are regulations, not directives, so they're at the European Union level, not at the individual country level. The target adoption is next year, with a transition period to get people up to it. Some of the significant things that you're going to see include a significant reduction in notified bodies. The estimate is that of the 80 or so notified bodies that exist today, after the new regulations, there will probably only be 30 or perhaps even less than 30 notified bodies. There's a requirement for what will be additional competence necessary both for manufacturers and notified bodies. We're going to see increased scrutiny of Class 3 devices and changes in audits, allowing the notified bodies to do unannounced audits as the FDA does, so that a change in how they come in and do their audits, or can do them. And there will be also increased post-market surveillance. I'm sure you're all aware that there were changes to the medical device directives that went into effect in 2010. The thing that was the most important for software was a new essential requirement that required the software lifecycle to be state-of-the-art. The requirement was that software had to be validated to state-of-the-art, including looking at the software lifecycle. 62304 being a harmonized standard for software, therefore kind of became the state of the art. So the expectation is that everyone doing software can achieve the same level as the requirements in 62304. But what actually happened when that change went into effect was that the notified bodies didn't really have the expertise to evaluate how the manufacturers were actually using 62304. So there wasn't a lot for the first year or two in terms of notified bodies really looking closely at your software process. But notified bodies, some of them at least, have really been increasing their expertise, and they're really starting to look much closer and raise questions about how manufacturers are implementing 62304. And just recently, they put a team of software people together and created a frequently asked questions document on using 62304 for regulatory purposes in the European Union. Another of the changes in that 2010 change, the changes that went into effect in 2010, had to do with software as a medical device. In that change, the directive clearly stated now that software by itself could be a medical device. Unfortunately, there was a lot of questions as to what software that applied to, and there was a lot of confusion around some of it. So the Swedish Competent Authority put together a group of stakeholders in Sweden and put out a guidance for determining what software is a medical device. At about the same time, the standards groups that dealt with health informatics, SEN TC 251, and medical electrical equipment, which is Senelec TC 62, put together a group called Software as a Medical Device. And together, these two organizations put input in to the medical device experts group, and they created a software experts group and created a MedDev document on qualification and classification of standalone software. That still left some fuzzy gray areas, and this year Sweden has just revised their guidance. That was just, their new guidance was released, I think, the end of January. And now the software, the medical software group from the European, that advises the European Commission, is also looking at perhaps revising this MedDev document. And there's a new group as well working on software regulation, and that's the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, a group of regulators from around the world who are trying to harmonize or at least align some of the regulations. And one of the new things they're looking at is how to regulate standalone software. In the US, in 2010, a draft guidance document was created for safety, for infusion pumps, which required the use of safety assurance cases and static analysis tools. And this has now, the FDA has now been looking at how this has worked out, and have been interviewing the manufacturers who have submitted new products using this draft guidance, and I believe are likely to increase the number of devices that need to provide safety assurance cases sometime in the future, and it's not clear what devices they might extend that to, but they seem to be very positive about the results they've gotten with safety assurance cases. The FDA also clearly showed that software was a medical device by creating a classification for a device type called medical device data systems, which is primarily software applications which transfer, store, display data that has been obtained from a medical device. So they have also made it very clear that software can be a medical device. More recently, they have issued a draft guidance for mobile apps, that are mobile medical apps, and have said how they think they would like to regulate those, and I'll talk a little more about that later when I get to the emerging issues. Another emerging issue has to do with medical device security. And this past year, the U.S. General Accounting Office did a report on the FDA FDA's approach or ability to review security of wireless medical devices. That will also cause some changes at the FDA. A final thing in regulation was the FDA Safety and Innovation Act, which has required a joint study by the Office of the National Coordinator for Health IT, the FDA, and the Federal Communications Commission to create a regulatory framework for health IT. And that report was due 18 months after the legislation was passed, which makes it due in January of 2014. The agencies have recently formed an advisory group to give them input on what this risk-based regulatory framework should look like. Something that hasn't been talked about was mentioned in the FDA's response to the GAO study about security was that FDA has been looking at their own pre-market review activities in the software area. So they hired the consulting group McKinsey to study how they do it. They looked at what the FDA reviewers did. They looked at industry practices. And one conclusion they drew was that industry is hesitant to adopt new practices because they don't know what that's going to mean to their submissions. The software experts within FDA have stated a number of times that they think the medical device industry software practices are lagging behind other safety critical domains, and that they have been hoping that the industry would begin to adopt new practices. This study seemed to say that one of the reasons the industry isn't doing that is FDA itself. So FDA is trying to determine how they're going to respond to the study. And one of the things they're looking at is trying to have a more consistent process for their software reviews. Currently, whether or not a software expert is called in to look at the software in a review depends upon the lead reviewer that gets the submission. They get to decide, they decide themselves whether or not additional software review is needed. And if they do, depending on what part of the Office of Device Evaluation they are in, they may have software reviewers within their group, or they may have to go to other groups within the FDA to bring in an expert. If they're going to have a consistent process, FDA is going to need some kind of formal training program. They also want to try to collaborate with industry to understand how to do some kind of continuous performance improvement of medical device software. And in order to do all of that, they need to look at how do they govern software functions at CDRH, which are currently spread out across several different offices within CDRH. For a couple of other countries, in Japan, 62304 is now a Japan industry standard. That's the first step that's necessary to move that into the legal structure, and work is currently underway to incorporate it into the pharmaceutical affairs law, as well as making standalone software products also be considered medical devices. Currently in Japan, they are not, software cannot be a medical device. So there is an effort to also to change that in the law. In China, SFDA last year completed a guidance document for software. That document is largely based off of 62304 with a few things from the FDA thrown in. It requires, it defines different software classes as they are defined in 62304 and requires different documentation for the different classes. One issue that has come up with their guidance is that they have indicated that any change to software after the software has been submitted and the device has been registered requires a new submission. So if any software in the field is different than that, than this in any way than the software that was part of the submission, then a new submission is necessary. Many companies and industry groups are trying to tell them that this is not a very reasonable way to proceed. But thus far, I don't think anything has changed. My understanding is that the software experts understand the issue, but they are not making the changes. Okay, so let me switch to standards and talk a little about 62304. Many of you may know that 62304, which was adopted originally in 2006, had a review in 2011, a 5-year review, and it was determined that some revision was necessary. So work began on that, and just recently at a standards meeting last month, a decision was made to kind of divide that work into 3 different sections. One will be an amendment to the current edition or the edition 1. A second one will be become a separate technical report, and then finally there will be a follow-on second edition after those are completed. So the amendment is expected by early next year. The technical report for the capability assessment then later that year, and the second edition following a year or 2 later. So I'm going to go through each of these pieces in a little more detail. In the amendment, one of the major changes is going to be how the software safety classification is determined. There was, there was a concern about. It seemed as though almost all software was ending up being Class C, which wasn't the intent in the standard. So there was a look at why that was happening, and a decision was made to try to use risk rather than only using consequence to determine the safety class. So there's in the current draft of the amendment, there is a flow chart of showing how the class is determined. As it currently exists, the first box in that is in the current document. If the software can contribute to a hazardous situation, then it is going to be Class B or C. If it can't contribute to a hazardous situation, then it's Class A. But the next little loop in there is not in the existing document, and that allows you to look at risk mitigations outside of the software system and use those to reduce the class of the software. And then if it's not possible to control the risk without software mitigations or software risk controls, then the software will become either Class B or Class C, depending on the level of harm. So a slightly different way of classifying the software, which the working group hopes will lead to a little less software ending up in Class C, and only that software that really needs that level of process would be actually classified that way. Second thing that's in the amendment is requirements for legacy software. Legacy software is defined as existing software that was in place and in use before 62304 was harmonized. And this change is needed because we have software that's in the field that hasn't been changed, but that needs to comply with 62304 in order to have continue having a CE mark. So the approach in the amendment is to define some requirements that a manufacturer would follow to determine whether or not the documentation that they do have is sufficient, along with post-market information to show that the process that was used is actually sufficient to meet the intent of the standard and meets the essential requirements. There are a couple of other technical changes that are in the amendment. One is an addition of a process to identify and remove common software defects. This is a way in the standard to kind of get at the requirement FDA has put on the infusion pumps for the use of static analysis tools. The standard isn't requiring use of static analysis tools, but we do recognize that there are known common defects, and that there should be ways to find and remove those defects. We shouldn't continue to see those kind of coding errors in medical devices when they get to the field. There's also some a requirement for some network aspects that are necessary if the medical device is intended to be used on a network. So there's a requirement added into the software requirements to make sure that you document those needs. And then there's a number of changes made where the standard was found to be confusing by the people who are trying to use it. So we've tried to clarify the intent of those requirements. Those don't really change the requirements. It's some changes in wording to try to clarify it. The technical report that will be done was in the first draft of the revision as a annex. It is a process reference model and process assessment model that allow an organization's capability to be determined. So if you're familiar with the maturity models that are used by the SPICE model or the Software Engineering Institute's capability assessment models, this is the kind of information that's in this technical report, and it's intended to be used for either process improvement by a manufacturer or possibly to assess potential software developers that a manufacturer might want to contract with. And then the third part of the 62304 changes are would be the second edition will expand the scope from medical devices to health software. This is part of a more general expansion that as the different countries and at different times, countries treat software differently. We don't want to see requirements for software we don't want to see software being held to different requirements depending on where it's executing. So if it executes on medical electrical equipment, then that should be, it should have the same requirements as if that same software executed on a server or was delivered as a service over the internet. And this will be done, the work on this will be done in parallel with the amendment, but as I indicated, it will be probably a year or two behind the amendment. Another new standard that goes along with that is 82304, which is intended to be a product standard for the standalone software. So this is intended to cover the parts of development and that are not covered by the 62304 standard. And to give you an idea of how that what that covers, this is the V model that's in the 62304 standard. The bottom part, the light green color, is covered by 62304. In the standard, in the 62304 standard, the top part of this diagram is covered by the 60601 standard and the PIMP section of that. But 60601 does not address standalone software. So for a standalone software product, there was no standard that covered this top part of the V diagram. So 82304 is intended to fill that gap and cover this part of the diagram. So it's not intended to replace in any way 62304. It will have a reference to 62304 in it for that, the software portion, software development portion, and the higher system level requirements then will be in 82304 as they are in 60601. And in talking about 60601, the amendment has now been approved, the first amendment for 60601, and in that amendment, it now is required to comply with 60601. If you have software, you must comply with 62304. And there have also been a few additional requirements included, again, for devices intended to be used on a network. And just recently, the decision was made that 60601-1-4 will be withdrawn, and that will happen shortly. Another standard that's worth mentioning is the AAMI Technical Information Report on Guidance on the Use of Agile Practices in Development of Medical Device Software. This group actually looked for or took a look at what needed to be done when you're using Agile to comply with 62304 and the FDA regulations and guidance documents on software. So the chair of that group is Patty Krantz, who was part of the 62304 original working group and is now chairing the group that's doing the revision in 62304. And there were 3 FDA software people in the group. So I think they've done probably a very good job of determining what items need to be included when you're using Agile to make sure that you comply with both the standard and the FDA regulations. So switching to things that are now very active and a lot is going on. There are three issues that I wanted to talk about. The first one is medical device security. Within our current standards, in our medical device standards, security is treated just as a safety risk, like any other safety risk. In most of the existing health informatics standards, when they talk about security, what they're really talking about is data privacy and protecting data from inappropriate access. The only mention of security in 62304 is in the area of software requirements, and it just states that if it's appropriate, the manufacturer shall include security requirements, and that's the only information it gives you about it. In the IEC 80001 standard, which addresses all of the stakeholders really that are needed when you have a network and a medical device on a network, 80001 actually revised the definition of harm to include breach of data and system security as a harm. So as risk management is done under 80001, then breach of data and system security is something that you're trying to prevent as part of the risk management, whether actual patient injury occurs or not. I mentioned briefly the General Accounting Office report on the FDA's review of wireless medical device security. This came about after a number of well-publicized incidents of people hacking either pacemakers or insulin pumps. And after this made the newspapers, Congress asked FDA or asked GAO to take a look at why these problems would be in these devices that FDA had approved. GAO did their study and reported that they believed FDA had the authority and should look at security, but it wasn't always doing it. It was not consistent. And this is part of, along with the software review of what gets looked at is very much at the discretion of the lead reviewer. So the expectation would be that FDA, when they revise their software pre-market review process, that they will also focus on ensuring that security gets reviewed for these devices. FDA has also announced that they are going to revise their cybersecurity guidance document that was issued in 2005. And in talking to the people that are working on that, they haven't given any likely date for when that would come out, but they did say that two of the things that they expected to add to that would be a requirement to identify when you have to report a security vulnerability that is recognized in a product that's in the field, and when the security vulnerability will require a recall. So they're going to put some requirements in this guidance about reporting and taking necessary steps to correct the problem, depending on the situation. So while hacking has gotten a lot of press and publicity, the people who are the experts in security really don't think that hacking is the major concern. The major concern or biggest risk that they've identified is the wide-scale unavailability of patient care by people causing, in some way, taking over or causing hospital networks to not be available and not be able to transfer or communicate data. So people's electronic medical records being unavailable, for instance. The second risk that they identify is integrity of data from medical sensors. And they've made rather large statements that you really have to look at security from the very beginning. And the thing that makes it particularly difficult in healthcare is that we can't really interrupt the clinical workflow and force significant changes in how the clinical workflow functions in order to be able to add security on. So it really needs to be planned in a very careful manner. One of the big issues in security that the hospitals have complained about is OS being out of date, and the fact that they have medical devices that have operating systems that are no longer supported and are no longer being updated and fixed as security issues come up. And they are seeing this as being getting significantly worse in the next year as Microsoft stops support of Windows XP. So one of the things that the hospitals are saying is that there really needs to be a plan when medical devices are developed for how they're going to be able to upgrade their operating systems in the future, because they're likely to be used for much longer time than the operating system will be supported. And that's probably something that you need to look at in terms of seeing the regulators start to say that that's starting to insist that there be a plan for how those operating systems will be managed if they're no longer supported. Within standards and security, there's an existing technical report for 80001 that talks about communication of medical device security needs. It's organized around 20 security capabilities that need to be achieved. There's an existing document called the Manufacturer's Disclosure Statement for Medical Device Security that was created. It's a template. It was created initially for the information that manufacturers must communicate to hospitals to meet the HIPAA privacy regulation in the US. It is being revised to align the information that needs to be provided to the hospital with this 80001-2-2 guidance document. And the next step, which will be getting started this year, will be to map some existing security controls to these same capability standards to give people an idea of what controls they need to implement in order to be able to achieve the particular capabilities. Interoperability issue is one that the FDA has really been driving. They've been providing leadership on that. Probably the interesting thing here is they've created a public-private partnership called the Medical Device Innovation Consortium, an area that will be able to take research grant money from both the government and private sources and use that to do research. One of the areas that they expect to be doing it on is interoperability. And a very recent study by West Health showed that there's a great deal of money wasted each year because of a lack of interoperability. AAMI and Underwriters Laboratory have announced they're going to do some joint work on trying to develop a series of interoperability standards. And then the last one is on mobile apps. I mentioned the International Medical Device Regulators Forum. They're trying to get a consistent approach to that. But many of these issues have to do with policy, not with technical issues. So it's going to be difficult. The standards approach is to say, let's look at risk-based approach, say what the good practices are, let the regulators decide how to use them. This is the FDA's approach to mobile medical apps. They are focusing on the top of the pyramid on those that meet the device definition and that they think are have a significant safety concern. They've also have said they are working on a draft guidance for medical device decision support systems. So I think you can imagine that it will have the same kind of approach where only those decision support systems that are considered the most safety critical or the most risk will be regulated as medical devices. And finally, in Europe, there's some work being done potentially to create a regulatory framework for e-health and health IT that would be independent from the current medical device regulations. So this is, and there's an anticipation that this will be discussed at the e-health week next week. The European Union and the U.S. have agreed to cooperate on using standards and trying to support the development of those standards. But it's not too clear exactly what they're going to do about that. But again, it's likely to be discussed at the Health Week. And it's clear that it's there's going to be a lot of activity in this area over the next year or two. All right, so that's it. If you've got some time left, Rami, we can do some questions.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. First of all, thank you very much for this fascinating information. I will summarize it a little bit later once we conclude this session. Sherman, we have a colleague of yours, I believe, Mr. Stanley Luzen, would like to introduce a question.
Not question. Hi, Cher.
Hello, Stanley.
Hi. Pleasure to meet you in Shanghai. I listened to you here in Tel Aviv very well. I'm very glad that you can spread from your experience. And it's the first time when the level of presentation of 62344 is done in this way, which I suggest will be very interesting for the audience from here, and especially for the Orcanos company. How can how need to be done, how you know very well the product from the Orcanos, how the product of the Orcanos can fulfill the requirement for 62304 from the point of view of the maintaining the documentation.
Maintaining the documentation.
Yes, like a maintenance tool.
Yeah, well, you know, I really should let the people there who really know the product inside out answer that question, Stelly. I'm not an expert, I think, on the tool, so I shouldn't try to answer that. But let Rami or one of the people there from Orcanos say something about how they would manage that at the maintenance of the documentation.
In this case, you're waiting to come here physically into to doing this. Okay. Thank you, Sharon. Good luck. Bye.
All right. Thank you.
I would like to say a word or two about what I got from this presentation. Two things. One is that the FDA understand right now that medical device vendors are a little bit off track from the mainstream of new development methods. This is a great conclusion because we do sense that medical devices are concerned about making a change in the development processes due to what Sherman has mentioned, to the pre-marketing stage. Impact on those changes. So we're definitely encouraging here, and that's what I was discussing earlier about the maturity of the market to make a change in the culture in order to adopt new technologies along with new techniques and methods. This is one conclusion. The other one, which is also very important, I think, that the 82304 is approaching the product requirements. A product requirements by cultures-wise saying here, we say with the companies we are working with, is something that is still not inherited in the development process. A requirement starts from the product. It doesn't start from the implementation. And usually what we do, we do reverse engineering to the product requirement based on what we actually developed. And this is a major change in the approach. And I'm glad to hear that the FDA put attention on that part and now will require some more serious work from the vendors to identify and design the product with a marketing objectives and business objective, and then go through the implementation. What makes the difference in the overall market, where you look at companies overseas where their products are already being sold at the day they are being launched. Look at what happens with iPhone, with Galaxy, and other products, not necessarily from the medical device. So this is, I think, great news. And thank you again for your fascinating lecture. And looking forward to keep in touch with you. There is there is one question now. Okay, just a second. There is one question coming up.
Hi, Sherman. Thanks for a very informative session.
Can you hear, Sherman? Can you hear?
Yes, I can.
One of the great concerns that we've had as somebody who's been involved in this area for many years is the FDA's entrance actually into software regulation. As we know, software changes every single day. Do you really foresee the FDA being able to actually regulate healthcare IT or medical software in a way that just won't kill innovation? Especially the last point, which wasn't mentioned as part of the FDA, but a requirement that there be an operating system upgrade path is almost an impossibility. I mean, how are medical device manufacturers supposed to predict the future as to where operating systems are going to go? And how are they going to support something like that? So I'm greatly concerned about the FDA's entrance into this field because I just don't see them being able physically to regulate it.
I think the FDA is aware that they need to do things differently in this field. They also, I mentioned the FDA Safety and Innovation Act, which is got us going on, and talking to people who are involved in that work group. They are looking at looking for ways to do this much. To have much simpler regulation supported by tools, supported by templates, so that people can show their that they have achieved the level of safety that is necessary without having to do all of the specific documentation and requirements that the FDA has currently. So another of the items that got mentioned was the safety cases, and safety cases could be a way that a lot of innovation could be allowed without being stifled by regulation, by allowing the company to come in and say, here's what we've done, and this is why it's good enough, rather than the FDA telling them what they have to do. So I think there's certainly some movement in that area, and it's not clear, as I said with that last slide with the European Union. They're looking at potentially having a completely separate regulatory framework for the e-health, health IT than the medical device framework. And that could be a similar kind of result out of the FDA study as well. I don't know that it'll go that way, but that's there's certainly potential for that.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Sherman, for being with us. And probably we're going to talk on another opportunity.
All right. Well, thank you all for your attention, and have a great rest of your day and the rest of your event.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.